Raven Brings Fresh Water, retold by Fran Martin. All the indigenous people of the Pacific Northwest tell tales about Raven, who is sometimes a trickster and sometimes a good friend to humankind. Here, he brings fresh water to the thirsty people who lived along that rock-strewn, fog-bound coast. In the beginning, there was nothing but soft darkness, and Raven beat and beat with his wings until the darkness packed itself down into solid earth. Then there was only the icy black ocean and a narrow strip of shoreline. But people came soon to live along the coast, and Raven felt sorry for them, poor, sickly things, who never had any sunshine. They lived by chewing on nuts and leaves and crushed roots of the alder trees for something to drink. I must help them, thought Raven, and he flew down to earth, calling, "Ga, ga, ga," and gathered the people together. Like ghosts they were, shadowy and pale in the misty darkness. "Raven has come," they told each other. "It is Raven who sets things right." The poor things were encouraged, and they gathered round to see what he would do. Raven plucked a branch from an alder and scattered the leaves on the surface of a pool. At once the leaves were sucked under, and the water started to bubble. After the pool had boiled for a moment, the surface cleared, and fish began to jump there. So that was how Raven gave the people fish. But now that they had fish to eat, they were thirstier than ever. They called on Raven, and down he came, and the people said, "Here is Raven who sets things right." Raven knew that there was only one spring of fresh water in all the world. A man named Ganuk had built his house around it and refused to give any away. "Maybe," thought Raven, "I can drink enough to carry some back to the people." So he went to the house and asked to come in, and Ganuk was very glad to have his company. Raven sat down and made polite conversation, and pretty soon he asked for a drink of water. "Very well," said Ganuk grudgingly, and he showed him the spring, a crystal pool welling up in a basin of rock. "Don't drink it all," Ganuk warned him. "You know that's the only fresh water in all the world." Raven knew it well. That was what he had come for. But he said, "Just a sip," and drank until he staggered. "Hold on there, Raven," cried Ganuk. "Are you trying to drink the well dry?" That was just what Raven was trying to do, but he passed it off lightly. He made himself comfortable close to the fire and said, "Ganuk, let me tell you a story." Then Raven started out on a long, dull story about four dull brothers who went on a long, dull journey. As he went along, he made up dull things to add to it, and Ganuk's eyelids drooped, and Raven spoke softly and more slowly, and Ganuk's chin dropped upon his chest. "So then," said Raven gently, with his eyes on Ganuk, "on and on, through the long gray valley, through the soft gray fog, went the four tall gray brothers, and now snore." And Ganuk began to snore. Quick as a thought, Raven darted to the spring and stuck his beak into the water. But no sooner had he lifted his head to swallow than Ganuk started up with a terrible snort and said, go on, I'm listening. I'm not asleep." Then he shook his head and blinked his eyes and said, "Where are you, Raven? What are you doing?" "Just walking around for exercise," Raven assured him, and back he went, and in a low, unchanging voice, he went on with the long, dull story of the four brothers. No sooner had he started than Ganuk began to nod, and his chin dropped down, and he jerked it back and opened his eyes and scowled at Raven and nodded his head and said, "Go on, what next?" And his head dropped down upon his chest. "So on and on," said Raven slowly, "over the hills went the four tall, gray brothers. The air was thick and gray around them. Fog was stealing softly over the mountains. Fog before them, fog behind them, soft, cloudy fog. And now snore." And Ganuk began to snore. Quietly Raven slipped to the spring, and glub, 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 he drank up the water until the pool was dry. But as he lifted his head for a last long gulp, Ganuk leapt up and saw what he was doing. "So, Raven," shouted Ganuk, "you think you can lull me to sleep and steal my water?" He picked up his club and started to chase Raven round and round the fire. Raven would run a few steps and flap his big wings and rise a few inches off the floor. Then, with a last tremendous flap, he went sailing toward the open smoke hole. But he had swallowed so much water that he stuck fast in the opening, and there he struggled, while Ganuk shouted, "You squint-eyed Raven, I've got you now, Raven, you miserable thief." And Ganuk threw green elder logs on the fire and made a great smoke that came billowing up and almost choked Raven to death. Raven hung there, strangling and struggling, until at last he pulled free with a mighty wrench and went wobbling heavily off across the sky. He was so heavy he flew in a crooked line, and as he flew, he spurted little streams of water from his bill. These became rivers, first the Nas and the Sitka, then the Taku and the Iskut and the Stikine. Since Raven flew in a crooked line, all the rivers are crooked as snakes. Here and there he scattered single drops, and these became narrow creeks and salmon pools. And so Raven brought fresh water to the people. But he bore the mark of that smoke hole ever after. He had gone to Ganuk as a great, white, snowy creature, but from that day on, Raven was black as the endless sky of the endless night.